Hey there. Are we live?
I think we are.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm seeing we're just picking up the participants. Everybody was in the waiting room, so I will give it just, there we go. Perfect. All right. So thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Shelley Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of National Capital Freenet. We're really excited to talk about the relationship between internet performance and digital equity in urban Canada today. So much so that I'm going to try and keep my comments as brief as possible. I can say right off the bat, we're recording the event. I know that's one of the questions I end up asking a lot. So let me just tell you now. And we anticipate also making the slides available for those who want them. So we'll send a follow-up email to everyone who registered. I would also like to start by acknowledging that I'm here today from Ottawa, which is built on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. And unfortunately, in terms of reconciliation, digital equity is a real challenge for Indigenous peoples in urban areas as well as Indigenous communities. So that's something that we have to do better on. Of a kind of that kind of mode. There's also a dedicated Q&A box for submitting questions to the panelists, and that's being monitored. So, we're going to be able to keep track. If we miss your question or don't get to it today, we will endeavor to answer it up in that follow-up message that we're sending. So with that, I'm going to get right to our panelists today. So we've got Jeff Buell. He's the Internet Performance Test Manager at CIRA. We've got Andrew Marty-Asari. He's the Business and Community Development Manager at National Capital Freenet. And we've got Drew Bell, Director of Information Technology for the City of Saskatoon. So thank you all so much for being here. Really excited. We're going to start with some short presentations from each panelist. And so when I say short, I mean, if it starts to tick on, I might remind folks that we have a broader discussion to get to. So we're going to follow that with some discussion between the panelists themselves, because I know y'all have things to talk about, even more than you already have. And then some questions that come from those of you who are watching and put in the Q&A box. And then if I can't help myself, maybe a couple of questions from me as well, depending on time. Jeff, do you wait, please?
Thanks, Shelley. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm just going to start to share my screen. Shelley, can you just let me know if you can see my presentation
I will let you know if I see your slides. There we go. I've got it. You started screen sharing and we're up. We're good to go.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thanks, Shelley. Thanks, everyone. Hi, my name is Jeff Buell. I'm the Internet Performance Test Program Manager here at CIRA. So with my part of the chat, I just want to talk a little bit about the barriers to connectivity in rural areas versus the barriers to connectivity and the challenges in urban areas. I want to talk a little bit about the Internet Performance Test and some of the insights that we found from the data that we've collected over the years, and particularly the importance of using high resolution in detailed data to gain those insights. Also, I just want to briefly talk about and demonstrate the Internet Performance Test and how the results from running tests can help individuals with a little bit of troubleshooting on their own connection. So a little bit about me and my background. So I've spent most of my career working with rural and remote Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities to address their connectivity gaps. The barriers in rural and remote connectivity are caused mostly by low population density, low population, geographic challenges like distance, rock, water, trees. This makes building networks in low density areas fairly expensive and difficult to maintain, and much lower revenue potential for operators. So the results typically mean that rural consumers have fewer options and they pay more for less quality service. So myself, I also live in a rural community in Northern Ontario. Really struggled for a number of years with a variety of slow and highly unstable connections. The work from home and learn from home requirements during COVID, plus my kids getting a little bit older, meant that I had to take some steps in our own hands to secure a better access for our family. So I really understand the challenges and the impact of connectivity barriers on a personal level as well as a professional one. So the pictures that you're looking at, so that this was our home about 2 years ago. We had to put a tower up on our property to connect to the internet. So we live in a low area, so we needed that additional height to secure line of sight to a distant tower. Fortunately for us, we worked with an area internet service provider that allowed us to do some of the ground prep work to offset the costs. So again, that tower, there's actually a climber up on the top of that tower, and that's what we use to connect directly to the internet. But up at the top there's another antenna, so that allows anyone within about a kilometer or a little bit less than a kilometer to also connect and use that same service. So just about CIRA, the organization that I work for. So we're best known for managing the .ca web domain. We provide a suite of registry services and other cybersecurity products as well. But a key part of our mandate is to give back through our Net Good program. So that includes our grants program that provides funding to over a dozen community initiatives each year that focus on either building infrastructure, supporting online safety initiatives, or helping address gaps in policy. It also that program also provided funding to the National Capital Freenet Community Wi-Fi project that's happening in Ottawa that Andrew is going to talk a little bit about in a minute. We also have a free DNS resolver called Canadian Shield. If that's installed on a device or a family network, that helps prevent or block harmful content or malicious content right at the source. We've always been contributors and supporters of Canadian Internet Exchange Points. So these are physical locations on the backbone of the Canadian Internet that where Internet service providers meet and peer and exchange data and traffic, and also connect with content. And then there's the Internet Performance Test, which I'm a part of. So we've operated that test since 2015. That can be found at performance.cira.ca. And so that allows anyone with an internet connection to measure their broadband speeds in real time and under real world conditions. So since we've launched it, we've collected over 1.5 million tests, and that we keep that in a crowdsourced database. The data helps individuals that run tests to see what they're actually getting, but it also helps researchers, policymakers, communities, other leaders to visualize where connectivity is strong, but also probably more importantly to understand where there's upgrades needed more urgently. So I mentioned it can be run by anyone in Canada. So a few clicks gives you that instant feedback on download, upload speeds, quality metrics like packet loss, latency, as well as jitter. The test interface also allows you as individuals to track your performance history. So the results of the test can be used to compare like what you're actually receiving running tests, and compare that to your bill or your contract with your internet service provider to see what you're paying for versus what you're receiving. And you can do a little bit of troubleshooting to look at maybe there's a bottleneck or a configuration issue on your home Wi-Fi network that might be the issue, or it could be caused by factors like congestion on the last mile network. For us, for CIRA, we like to look at the data in an aggregated sense, and we can look at the differences in broadband performance over time, hopefully to see that upward trend of improvement over time. And also we can look at it to look at the differences in geographic areas, which I'll talk to you in a little bit about. So there's two main components of the internet performance test. So first, there's this top panel where you can run the test, click start. There's a few little questions that we ask. Once it runs, it takes about 30 seconds, and then the results are displayed. So the next day, overnight, that data gets anonymized and dropped into our database, and then it's shown on this. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but if it can be, it's shown on this interactive map. Obviously, this is a screenshot. It's a static one, but those clusters are representing the 1.5 million tests that have been run in Canada. If I were to zoom in and zoom into a particular area, they would scatter and multiply and become more specific to the area where the test was run. So I encourage you, if you're interested, that's performance.cira.ca. So the legend here, we're looking, I've moved over to Eastern Canada. I don't think I explained the legend, what we're looking at here. So these clusters, the deeper the blue, we're looking at download speeds. So the deeper the blue, you see tests that have high download speeds. In red, you see lower speed tests that are below, like say 10 megabits per second. The blue is about 50 megabits per second. So I just want to draw your attention. So Quebec City is around here down to Windsor, Ontario. So this corridor here, that's about 50% of the Canadian population that lives there. So lots of urban density, lots of density networks, lots of internet capacity, which usually translate, as you can see, a lot of blue. So a lot of fast tests that we're receiving. So some years ago, the Canadian government set a target that they wanted every Canadian to have access to internet that can deliver 50 megabits per second down and 10 megabits per second up. So again, back in that area, we're double, at least double that speed that most tests come on the platform. So I just want to point that out because it's problematic when we're trying to understand where connectivity gaps exist, that it's a problem when we're looking at it from too far of a distance. Just because averages might be high, it doesn't mean that everyone has equivalent services. So I hope in the next couple slides that I can demonstrate that. So I'm just going to zoom in into Ottawa and Montreal. So here's Ottawa and here's Montreal. So I think we're already like kind of intuitively seeing a picture that we would expect, that we would understand. So our urban centers, lots of people live, lots of networks, high speed services are available to many people. But then when you get out into the surrounding areas, to the suburbs, less populated, sparsely populated areas, starting to see lots of red, less high performing services. I could show you this pattern in many different areas. It doesn't matter if we were looking at Edmonton or Vancouver, we'd see the same thing, urban density with higher performing tests, and then you look out into the rural areas and lower performing services. So I'm just going to zoom in then to Ottawa in particular, and let's look what happens here. So a little bit more granularity, a little bit more detailed view of connectivity at the neighborhood level here. So I think that's the danger, and that's what I'm hoping that I'm pointing out here is when we're looking at urban connectivity, we want to paint the entire city with too broad of a brush and assume that just because average speeds are quite high, that everyone is well served. So when we're looking at the data in a more detailed and higher resolution view, as we are here, we can see that connectivity is not homogeneous. So people are testing and their connections are at vastly different levels. So right in this map window, we've got about 50,000 tests that we've received in Ottawa since 2020. So even though median speeds are high and above that government threshold, 9% of the tests, believe it or not, fall below that government standard. So just to wrap up my comments here, so rural communities, the barrier is is a great deal about availability. So only about 67% of households in rural Canada can access broadband services. But that said, governments have been investing in building infrastructure for a number of years, and we can see a year-over-year improvement in growth in rural areas. Since COVID, those investments have accelerated. So perhaps there's a little bit of a reason to be optimistic in rural connectivity. In urban areas, there generally is availability, but the issue or the barrier is about access. Due to factors like affordability, digital literacy, and people's ability to harness the internet for all the things that they need it to do. or it could be cost to access things like devices, phones, tablets, computers are expensive. So I don't think, and Andrew, Drew, Shelley, you can correct me if I'm wrong, governments, I think, have a strategy to address rural access, and mostly that's investing in infrastructure, but I don't know what that strategy is to address access barriers in urban communities. And that's why I think projects, the community-led projects that we're going to hear from in a minute are so crucially important for urban areas. So thanks, that's my time. Appreciate you listening, and I'll stop sharing. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. There is a question about some of the testing processes in the Q&A. So you can have a look at that and we can address that afterwards if we don't get to it during the Q&A session, or we'll come back to it. So Drew, I was going to set you up next if you're ready to go. And you are on mute.
Thank you very much. Can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, all good to go. Thank you. You're in the next slide view rather than just the one big slide. But if it's not something that's easily fixed, don't worry about it.
Okay. So my name is Drew Bell. I am the Director of Information Technology for the City of Saskatoon. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about City of Saskatoon pilot project that we ran. And I think, as Jeff alluded to, this particular effort or challenge that we're looking at is really more so around the urban access to internet as opposed to the rural. And that is, as Jeff mentioned, more about the, sorry, I'm just going to go back here. It's really a little bit more about the challenges and constraints, roadblocks to accessing. Quite often, the infrastructure is there in most cases, but things like costs, poverty, and others are what prevents people from being able to gain access to it. A lot of those barriers are quite often, I would say, constraints behind the scenes, challenges where people with transient, I would say, with no fixed addresses and so forth, they typically can't even procure a personal data contract or device because of hidden constraints and costs that are inherent behind the scenes. So our project in particular, is a pilot project, and it was primarily, more than anything, was to better understand the challenges and situation out there. It spun out of COVID during COVID-19 when we were really from a task force exploring some of the challenges in our inner city. They brought forward to highlight that a lot of the people inside inner cities and facing poverty and low income and so forth, when they went to lockdown, they had no ability to communicate with them and they couldn't access vital services anymore. So it was brought forward to see if there was any type of what the options were with a technology solution. We did end up leveraging grant money. It was a very small amount of money to pilot a 4x4 block grid in that neighborhood. And we also partnered up with a number of different private institutions and charity institutions to find a reliable source for free device distribution in the pilot neighborhood. As was mentioned there, we were expecting 1,500 people-ish to be living in that neighborhood. What we found, we'll see later on, that actually the connectivity exceeded what the population was supposed to be, but that was kind of interesting. But like I said, it came out of the COVID era point in time, and we really realized that we needed to build a better awareness and understanding of the challenges that were there, and ultimately build out an action plan to go forward. We put a significant amount of effort into research to figure out where best to place the pilot. And I won't get into all of that, but some of our partnerships with the public schools, our own internal city data, and so forth, we were able to narrow it down and produce a heat map. And then we looked at leveraging our city infrastructure to enable it. The city does have a significant amount of fiber optics in the ground, and we also have, our city happens to own the light poles and traffic lights and power poles. So we had infrastructure that we could leverage and utilize. Pretty standard procurement that we went out once we had a plan and funding for it. Like I said, a big part of it was leveraging our own resources to implement, but the contract did require the vendor to provide the initial design work for us, and then we changed and augmented that to make sure it fit into the neighborhood. Primary outcomes that we're trying to achieve was provide internet access to within a residential neighborhood, build awareness and understanding of the city's role in addressing digital inequities, and exploring partnership opportunities with external institutions, public entities, community entities, to see how we can work together and towards achieving this and better understanding the situation. And also just in general to develop a clear understanding of the city's role and governance of a Wi-Fi network, and also the role in terms of addressing digital inequity. Say the project itself, it went live in 2023 February. It is still running. The connectivity rates that we saw exceeded actually our expectations, and that was always an interesting thing because from our initial conversations with some of the telecommunications people, this goes back to the urban challenge. They said they got the area covered, nobody's going to use it. And what turned out was that we're averaging around 1,800 unique devices connecting regularly to this Wi-Fi network. And obviously, maybe some people have more than one device, but in a core neighborhood, that's far less likely to be the case. And there's also some unknown populations that exist in that neighborhood. Like I said, it did exceed what we thought it was going to be. And just a little bit, we were a little surprised, I would say, to some degree, the speeds of penetration we are seeing across the network actually also exceeded our expectations. We're getting upwards of traffic in of 30 Mbps and traffic out of 5. That's pretty consistent. We did see some interesting numbers, which we kind of expected. Summer months, the capacity went down, and we are attributing that primarily to foliage in the blocking the Wi-Fi signals in the neighborhood, because it is an older neighborhood with a lot of trees. But one of the interesting things that we saw was that despite the fact that the throughput went significantly down, the demand didn't. And that was a really interesting realization or insight into the need or the dependency that exists within the community for internet access. There's a whole bunch of other information we're trying to sort of extrapolate from that as well. And some of that is on the type of usage, because there may in fact also be more of a prevalence to be using low bandwidth types of communications rather than some of the higher bandwidth. Although we do see smart TVs running out there, which is interesting. Anyways, there's a lot of other further information like we have been doing and are continuing to extrapolate a lot of information and to dissect that. But I would say the biggest thing that came as a result of this was one of our primary goals was to build a better understanding and awareness of the city as a whole, of the challenges that are out there. And it's led to the official decision for the city to go forward and develop a digital equity strategy going forward to make sure that we have really good firm direction and further understanding of it. And we're also hoping to bring into that some other partnerships like our university and maybe some of the private and other public institutions into the development of that, which will lead us in the future to look at expansion or other options or other technologies to address those specific digital equity challenges that exist. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So there is a question for you in the chat that we will get to, and you can have a look at in the meantime about how you're managing security and ID management on the city Wi-Fi. All right, and so Andrew, I put you last because I knew that I could put you under pressure to go fast. So if you could go fast-ish so we can get to the conversation, that would be great.
Sounds good. All right. Are you seeing my screen okay?
Yep.
Excellent. So I am Andrew Matiasari. I am the Business and Community Development Manager with NCF. NCF, National Capital Freenet, is the nonprofit internet service provider in the National Capital Region, Ottawa. And we are committed to digital equity. So we provide internet services to anyone at all, but we also concentrate on being able to provide other services, including digital literacy support, workshops, etc., to help people get online and use it well. So some of the stuff in my slides have already been touched on, so I might breeze through the earlier sections of it. So Jeff had mentioned this already, but there's the challenge of internet service adoption in Canada has largely been defined as a service availability problem. And so by 2030, the government is hoping to have 100% coverage in Canada. Particularly, Quebec is considered to have full access as of today. So there's supposedly 100% internet access in the province of Quebec. The challenge is the problem of definition. Definitely, we have a significant service availability gap that needs to be closed. But then there are also affordability and other adoption challenges that need to be addressed as well. So from an affordability standpoint, we know that even in areas where people have available services, there's an ACON study that said their respondents were having to trade other essentials like food or medicine, up to 65% of them, to be able to afford home internet connectivity. And so both in rural and urban areas, as service becomes available, the question is, can those in the community afford to get it? And then do they have the necessary support to be able to utilize it well and be fully participants online? Again, nationally, we've seen what we've seen over the years, and sorry, the national data ends at 2021 because that's where the data available ends. But we've seen that the internet has kept getting more expensive, and the choices that consumers have for internet providers keep dwindling. So from 2013 to 2021, over that 8-year span, price of internet, the average price went up almost 50%. And then even if you adjust for inflation, whatnot, that is still a really significant increase. And this is before a big inflationary period due to COVID. So we don't know what the numbers will look like when we have those numbers being updated. We also went through a period where, particularly in 2021, 2022, 2023, where lots of independent internet providers were acquired by the big incumbents. And so as we're having this dynamic of like pursuing this 100% service availability goal, we're seeing prices continue to pick up, and then we're seeing independent providers be purchased. And so a lot of these brands still exist, but then they are currently owned by big incumbents, and And we are yet to see fully what the effect of that is going to be on affordability in the market. And so we think there's a need to have community alternatives, nonprofits, like NCF can be bought, cooperatives, projects by municipalities, indigenous communities, where they have more ownership over their networks and can continue to provide high quality services, hopefully at affordable rates. Locally, we've partnered with Ottawa Community Housing and the Social Planning Council of Ottawa in the middle of COVID to survey respondents. And these are in buildings where, from a service availability standpoint, internet access is solved, but we found that 22% of the participants did not have internet access. And so just having the pipes, having the fiber, theoretically having an address that validates for up to 8 gigabit service doesn't mean anything if you cannot get it. For those without home internet services, the top reasons they gave, 52% of them said it's an affordability problem. This percentage does not even include those who have some kind of credit restriction. So either they failed a credit check in the past, or they don't meet some kind of credit requirement. So that's a separate 7%. And then in between those two, there's about 21% of respondents said they don't have the right devices to be able to connect. Notably, those who said the reason why they weren't online due to like their digital knowledge actually was also at 7%. So lots of people would want to be online in urban areas if they're able to afford it, and the significant challenge is being able to afford connectivity. For those who did have home internet connectivity and found it to be inadequate, the top 3 reasons they found were that the speeds was a challenge, the price was a problem, and we noticed even from the Acorn study that somebody having internet connectivity doesn't mean that it's affordable just because they pay for it. They may actually be making sacrifices to be online. And then the reliability is also a significant concern. So 60, 42, and 31%, respectively.
Okay, can I get us to move to the project, if you don't mind?
Sure. So we planned a project that targets the areas in Ottawa that have a really high rate of people facing social inequities. So the average low-income rate in Ottawa is about roughly 9%. In some of these communities, you're looking at 37%, 24%. I mean, the lowest one that touches where we're targeting has about a 15.6% low-income rate. And so we know from the data through our survey, and then from information we had from the census, which were provided by Social Planning Council of Ottawa, that this is where the highest need happens to be. So in this diagram here, where we have the axis exactly is where we are building our community Wi-Fi project. We are launching it from there, and we are hoping to reach within 2 to 5 kilometers of that and cover this significantly large density of areas with people living on low incomes. I'll briefly let's talk about what the project looks like. Technically, I'm happy to have further technical conversations later. But we're connecting 2 primary locations, which are twin locations next to each other. One is a high-rise tower, and then there's a low-rise right next to it. And they happen to be behind me as well. In my profile. So from the high-rise tower, we're going to provide Wi-Fi around the building. In the low-rise tower, we're going to provide Wi-Fi around the building as well. We are bridging these 2 buildings with a wireless connection. And then we are installing some fixed wireless gear to provide a proprietary wireless signal in the community. And within 2 to 5 kilometers, we will be connecting a minimum of 10 other community Wi-Fi hosts locations. So these are places that people are already going to receive different kinds of services, and we're hoping to provide coverage inside of those buildings for the public, and also within about 300 feet outside, radius outside of those buildings as well. And so the Carson's Community House or another community house in Bosolio is examples of places that we're hoping to have this connectivity. And we building the network in such a way that people should in the community should be able to seamlessly connect, whether they're in one of these primary locations with in and around their building, or they go to a community Wi-Fi host location, and we ensure that they are online, they're secure, and they don't have to worry or precautions have been taken to protect their privacy and to keep them secure on the network. And we're targeting speeds of 100 megabits to 200 performance of 100 to 250 megabits per second per user. And we building the network with gear and equipment that we're hoping actually performs much higher than that and can last at least 5 years in terms of performance, but hopefully even beyond that. So that is the gist of what the project looks like technically. We've received lots of help from other similar projects in planning it, including talking to Drew and his team about what they found in Saskatoon. And we also, as part of this project, collecting data from the community about the internet performance before we launch our project, and then we'll compare it with data we receive afterwards to see how their performance has improved in these communities as a result of launching the community Wi-Fi project. And then we are also updating the survey data that we had from before to see what changes we find after we've launched the project as well. So that's pretty much it from me. There's my email, you will get the slides, so you'll be able to reach out to me if you have any more specific questions, and I'm happy to answer them. And I'll hand it back to Shelley.
That's great. So we had a couple questions from the audience that I thought we should dig into first. So Drew answered one of them in the sort of discussion portal there. So we can touch on that. But first, let's deal with the one that hasn't been addressed at all, which is your test is from the device. This is for you, Jeff, not from the router, correct? So is it a true performance test?
Yeah, that's a really important question and a distinction that we're happy to point out. So yeah, ours is initiated from a website, from a device, and it runs so across the home network, just to be clear, across the last mile network, so the network that the internet service provider controls, then across a carrier network right to an internet exchange point. So we think it's more akin to real world usage, whether we're on webinars or teleconference calls or streaming media. So I think the question specifically was about plugging in or testing directly from the router, which would be using like a hardware-based test. So that isolates and blocks the home Wi-Fi network. So we think it's really important to test the home Wi-Fi network too, because it helps people understand where the bottleneck might be. So a lot of the times, I'm connecting through a Wi-Fi network. My router is downstairs, not too far away, but the further you get away from your Wi-Fi router, performance starts to diminish and decrease, speeds go down. So people are quick to identify the ISP as the source of the problem, but in fact, there may be steps that a person might take to improve it. Getting closer to the router or plugging into the router directly would improve performance. So I think linked in the chat is there's a blog article discussing all the different ways that you can do speed and performance testing. And it's not just hardware or software, it's just like the different methodologies of multi-threaded tests, single-threaded tests, what aspects of the network are tested. So it's an interesting debate, but just to be clear, ours is an end-to-end test. that's initiated by an active initiation by someone running a test, and it goes tests even like the device. There might be background things running on on somebody's computer. There might be other users on that home Wi-Fi network that are gobbling up resources. So part of it is to have that conversation and understand what impacts performance. So thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. So we got another question. Do you think there's need for a standardized test, especially with broadband labels coming?
It's an interesting one. Yeah, so what that is, I think, referring to is what's sometimes called broadband nutrition labels. So clearly outlining, ISPs are required to clearly outline speed and performance, not just theoretical top end speeds, but what's actually being experienced day to day and during peak times. So I think the CRTC has kind of addressed that. They've identified that tests do have to be off-network tests going to tier 1 cities at internet exchange points during peak times. So our regulator has more or less said that the methodology that CIRA uses in the internet performance test is the one that is the true measure of performance when we're trying to get everybody achieving that universal service objective of 50 megabits per second down and 10 up.
Okay, thank you. So I had a question sort of for all three of you. It feels like there are two major like implicit assumptions about what you were all describing. So one is that giving people digital access is good for them. You know, it's beyond just the straight connectivity. And so we'll start with that one. I wondered, you know, in your firsthand experience working on these issues, you know, what's the relationship basically between, you know, giving people digital access and other sort of positive outcomes for them? So Drew, do you want to start with that one? Oh, and you are on mute.
Yeah, sure. Quite interesting. I have to say, when we got into this pilot, I might have had my own perceptions of digital equity and some of the challenges that are out there. And when we really got into it, some of the outcomes and the needs were surprising to myself as well. As a few people alluded to, it's not just about the ability or the infrastructure to connect. It's also about the devices. They also talk about, you know, digital literacy, people being able to know how to do different things and access different things. But I would share one really interesting story that in my career in technology, I didn't think I would ever come across. We had at one point, there's a group of, through medical services through the province, there's a group called COAST, and they're an outreach program, nurses that deal with all sorts of special client needs, addictions, mental health issues, food, housing. And we had one of the nurses come in, and we had been able to procure free devices that the nurses could hand out to each of their patients whenever they tracked them down and found them, because it can be quite a challenge. And she was emotionally like in tears, because she said for the first time ever in her 15 years, she said her clients or patients were actually reaching out and finding them instead of waiting 4 or 5 days. And sometimes when people are in crisis, that 4 or 5 days of tracking people down can be life and death. And she had mentioned, and I still have it pinned up on my board because I didn't think I'd have a letter like that in IT. But she said, it's literally saving lives. And she goes, I can give you specific examples, but and she shared some stories without naming people, but it was quite amazing that the dependency and the need for connectivity can come in extreme examples, even above we worked a lot with public schools and so forth. There's lots of stories out there from different areas, food banks and associations, but that's a story that I would share anyways. That I found quite amazing.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Andrew, do you want to go next? And you are also on mute.
And somebody has to do that to these ones today. Yeah, so in my time with NCF, there have been definitely many examples of those interactions. I think part of what jumped out to me during COVID is just how clearly we were a digital default society. And so most of the things you need to do default to being online first. And sure, sometimes there is some way of getting it done without having data access, but it's way more cumbersome and frustrating. So whether it's filing your taxes, applying for employment insurance, applying for a job, try doing any of those things without connectivity, you're in trouble. I was talking to a lady, happened to be this weekend, who happens to have some connectivity issues, and was just describing some of the challenges that she was having. And she was like, oh, I just want to give up on this whole thing, but I don't know how I'm going to do my banking and, and my taxes and all of that. And I was like, yeah, that's so true. So is data access automatically good? No. But it's the default way in which we're doing a lot of our interactions today. And that's why it's also important to have the right supports, digital literacy and resource and supports to help people stay safe online and engage well.
Okay. And Jeff, can you speak to this, and maybe with the performance angle, why do people need those faster speeds sometimes than they might be able to get or afford?
Yeah, for sure. And just remind me, Shelley, if I go off on a tangent to answer that directly, but I just wanted to give a thumbs up to what Andrew said. It's the default, right? Like it's not inherently better way to do things, but digital access is needed for so many things, and there's just a momentum towards that. Accessing resources and content is just by default done online. So the performance part, Shelley, right? Like why it's needed. So speeds are one thing for sure. Improvements are needed, but it's also to make sure that connectivity is stable, to make sure it's secure, and to make sure it's affordable and available to everyone who needs it. Because, like, quite honestly, not everybody will need it. Like, there's a certain segment of people that don't need it, but it needs to be available for all. I hope that answered that, Shelley.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm not going to get to the second part of my question just because there are some questions in the chat, but I just wanted to at least mention. So in the chat, we have seen representation from North End Connect with Joel from ISOC Manitoba. I saw Shabukto Community Net in the chat, and then I saw John from 307 Net, which is a not-for-profit fiber provider here in Kentley. So, there's at least 3 organizations in the chat who are doing the same kind of thing City of Saskatoon is doing, that NCF is building. And we know that this is happening, more across Canada, and there's been an explosion of it, frankly, across the States. So just wanted to flag that this is like a burgeoning movement, right? And that there's something that communities are trying to do for themselves because they don't see it happening in the market. And I think it's interesting. So we've got the municipal city position from City of Saskatoon, and then we've got, some not-for-profits. So that will lead us into the questions. We have a question from Tom. Is there any hope of increasing competition between internet providers in terms of preventing the sort of near monopolies of the big telecom networks? Wow. I mean, does anyone want to tackle that?
That's like a question for me. Try not to go off on a regulatory tangent. I think the reason why these projects, the other ones you mentioned, are popping up is because there's a gap, and there's an increasing gap, and a lot of the mid-size-ish independent providers are going away, and so you're finding very localized projects, or whether in cities or towns across the country, and there'll need to be either support from funders like CIRA, but also, quite frankly, a greater emphasis on supporting middle and smaller size competition by our larger regulators. They have the biggest sway in the market. And so ISED and CRTC, just to make sure the environment is one that works for consumers in terms of lowering prices and giving them choice.
Yeah. And so I also just wanted to note there that, we talk about internet providers, but a lot of this is also when we're talking about free networks, telecom providers, right? Because, Drew was handing out those kind of connected devices where it's not competing with a home internet plan so much as maybe a data plan where, the costs are even higher and there are a lot more limitations in terms of usage. Drew, you mentioned about how some of the incumbents told you they didn't think anyone might use your network because, they had it all covered. So do you have a perspective on why did you go it alone if there are these big providers?
Well, I think that's part of really an interesting question. Because I think especially in the urban areas, and you're talking about digital equity, it's not and it will never be a profitable area for large providers to be, bringing high-speed services to, based purely on a profit model. I think what's interesting, and I think we spent a lot of time talking with places in the US and actually even a couple in Europe that were very much, or what we're going to say, they were down the road a lot further. And what they were really seeing is that the civic space in particular was kind of forcing definitely an uncomfortable conversation with the large providers, but it was kind of forcing the providers to think differently or participate differently. And instead of being that sole provider traditional source, they were developing partnerships where they would co-provide, different internet access programs or systems out there. So I think that seems to be a bit of a trend where for the urban civic space that, and that's why I think civic governments are stepping into it, because there isn't a profit in there for the big providers. I don't know, unless they decide to throw a lot of money at it with no return out of their own charity. I don't think they're going to get into that space. But I do think that having increased, I don't know if I'd call it competition, but awareness and that's out there, that it will tend to force them more into that area. And at the end of the day, they don't want it splashed all over the media that they don't care about digital equity. So remember, we are seeing different big telcos starting to change their tune a little bit in terms of different types of partnerships to address it.
Okay, thank you. So Daniel, I can see that Andrew is typing a response to your question. So we can answer that one through that means. Michelle, you asked the question about how NCF is coordinating the capital project with the City of Ottawa. So just as a quick sort of piece of that, so where the City of Saskatoon is able to, leverage all of its own resources, we've partnered with Ottawa Community Housing. So that's a municipally owned social housing provider. And so that's where we're building our initial towers. And then we also have backhaul connectivity being provided through EBU networks. And so that is owned by Hydro Ottawa, which in turn is wholly owned by the City of Ottawa. So we actually do not directly have a relationship at this point with the City of Ottawa, but we are harvesting in that same way that Drew is, although, ours requires more conversations and partnerships, but those same municipal resources. And I do think, it is a big opportunity. Michelle, you also made the point about, the way that it sometimes seems like the Rogers and Bell are splitting up connectivity sort of between themselves. And I do think, like we talked about, there's a role here for, my background is in community radio, so for community organizations to kind of, in cities to take the lead and kind of, go where the need is rather than where the market is. All right, so we're at 1:28. Very quick final comments from everybody, and Jeff, you get to go first.
Well, thanks. It's been great participating in this. I've learned a lot. So I guess my hope is that, like I said, there's some reason to be a little bit optimistic in the rural remote gap. I know that there's lots to be done, especially looking at the map that Andrew shared when we look province by province, territory by territory. But I hope that, like, as we near that universal objective, the conversations about equity start to come up, as well as the digital availability part. So just yeah, I'm hopeful that conversations like this continue to shine the light and bring awareness about the challenges, both rural and urban areas. So thanks.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Drew?
Thanks again for the opportunity, and I'll echo Jeff just a little bit. And I think there was a question even in the chat a little bit about the inspiration um, for doing this type of work. And just to highlight it, these are the conversations I think that not only inspire but enable a lot of the different whatever they are, community groups or government levels to try to address it. And it's seeing the successes, seeing the real stories of the people that are seeing benefit from these efforts. They truly do benefit and inspire the people, I think, working on them. And I think because there was a question in there around that, and it's, the more you learn about it, the more you hear other stories from different groups, and the more you can work together and collaborate, the greater the outcomes will be.
Perfect. Thank you. Andrew?
I would like to say thanks as well. I'll say first off to lots of I'll say our friends and partners across the country. In planning our project, we had maybe dozens and dozens of conversations with different community groups across Canada, some in the States, and research and others to help us get to the point where we could go ahead with it. I'll say also thanks to those who are local. And if you're in one of the areas that we're targeting and you want to see how you can support the project or be involved somehow, please reach out to us. And obviously a big thanks to Sarah for hosting this today and also allowing us to get this work done.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks to all three of you for being here. I know we did some planning and got to talk. I wish we even got to have kind of, a more fulsome conversation about all these issues. But to be honest, I think that it's, as we're building literally and figuratively, right, there's more and more of these conversations that need to be had. And the folks in the chat, a lot of them are doing this work as well, right? So like, let's continue these conversations and let's continue the work. I think that's really important. Thanks, Andrew, for shouting out CIRA. So certainly for funding the National Capital Freenet Community Wi-Fi project, as well as for pulling this webinar together and co-presenting it with National Capital Freenet today. So I think we're all good. Thank you so much, everyone. We will be sending out the videos and some additional information. And Maureen has dutifully been putting in so much additional information there if you missed it. So I think we'll try and harvest the best of that and also send it out so that everybody's got the resources that they need. Anything else? I think we're good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.